Great, thanks so much, Jack. That was really kind of you to give a generous introduction like that. I'm just up the road from Jack, so Jack's in North Devon, and I'm just an hour and a half up the road in Bristol, in my basement, surrounded by my cookbooks. I was saying to people before, and what I want to do is to talk you through a little bit of some of the work that I did on that book that Jack mentioned, Holocaust Landscapes. And what I wanted to do, and Jack, I hope you appreciate this, is in some ways to revisit Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen, so a couple of places that you've been to, and a couple of places that I think a lot of you who are watching this have been to on the different Het visits, either the Het visits to Auschwitz, or this year in the anniversary of the liberation, the Het visits to Bergen-Belsen. So we'll get to Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen, but what I wanted to do in some ways was to try and give us a kind of real sweep through Europe and the years of the war, and to think a little bit about how the Holocaust was this event that was kind of constantly changing and evolving and moving. And I think the important thing to think about there is to always have that in the back of your mind whenever you hear the testimony of a Holocaust survivor. So I know that most of you will have heard the testimony of at least one survivor. In many cases, you'll have heard the testimony of several survivors, maybe even during the AMCOM conference that's been taking place over the last couple of weeks. And one thing that I want to do in some ways is to kind of give you a bit of a background to the fact that one of the real challenges I think that people faced, Jewish people during the Holocaust, was that it wasn't something that was standing still, but was, if you like, a kind of moving target, that constantly this thing that we know as the Holocaust was kind of changing shape. And as a result, the kinds of questions that survivors were asking themselves about how do I survive, where should I go, what should I do, were constantly changing as well. And I'll give you a little bit of a sense of that maybe as we go through. What we should do with, I think, is we should start with the first landscape. So we should start with the landscape that Jack mentioned of ghettos. If you think about the ghettos within Europe, this is just a map showing a number of the larger ghettos within the Polish context. But we know that there's literally hundreds and hundreds of ghettos across Europe. In the place that I know best, Jack said that some of the work I've done is on Hungary. In Hungary, we think there were about 150 different ghettos that Jews were placed into in 1944. But for most Jews, ghettos came early on in the experience of the Holocaust, just after the German occupation of Poland in 1939. One of the first things that the German authorities do is they start putting Jews within ghettos, in these parts of the city that are fenced off or walled off, where Jews are now to remain living. And one thing that I've often been struck by is the way that this presented what Janina Bauman, a survivor of the Holocaust, talked about as a new question. That in 1940 in Warsaw, this Jewish family, the Bauman family, are living in the city, and the ghetto is being created in the autumn of 1940. And they're trying to work out at this moment in time whether it's better to go into the ghetto, which is where all Jews have been told that they need to move within a very short period of time, or whether it's better to try and go and hide on the so-called Aryan side, so to go and hide on the rest of the city outside the ghetto. And the thing that strikes me about Janina's question is that it's a question that for all of us seems a slightly bizarre question to ask, because we've all been to Auschwitz, many of us have been to Bergen-Belsen, and we know what the end of the story is. We know what happens, for example, at a place like Treblinka, where Warsaw's Jews are deported in the summer of 1942. But in 1940, no one knows that. I don't think the German state knows exactly what's going to happen next. But certainly a Jewish woman like Janina Bauman does not know what is going to happen next. And so for her and her family, they're trying to work out whether it's safer to go into this thing called a ghetto, this new kind of Jewish segregated living space within Warsaw, or whether it's safer to try and risk it and to hide out on the so-called Aryan side. Janina knows that to hide out on the Aryan side, you need contacts, you need money, you need looks, you need good Polish. There's all sorts of things that you need. And she feels like they don't have all of those things. And what the family decide to do is they decide to move into the ghetto. And so in the autumn of 1940, Bauman is one of hundreds of thousands of Jews that move into the Warsaw ghetto. Now, what's interesting, I think, is that when she starts to describe the ghetto, she describes it as in some ways kind of relatively normal, at least at first. And I think this is important, that this first stage for Polish Jews was not being transported directly to the concentration camps like Auschwitz that many of us had been to, but was instead, it was more familiar domestic space. It's interesting, I think when she describes it as a crowded flat, but a flat nonetheless. This isn't a barracks or a concentration camp surrounded by barbed wire, but it's the much more normal domestic space of an apartment building, although it's incredibly crowded and it doesn't look as nice as the apartment that she's moved out of. One of the things that you find across Europe is that ghettos are always placed in the worst parts of cities. There's quite clearly a sense, I think, in which when the Germans are moving Jews around in the city, that what they're doing is making sure that the very best properties become available. In the case of somewhere like Warsaw for Germans, or in the case of, for example, Hungarian cities, for non-Jewish Hungarians. One of the things that you see early on, and I think this continues all the way through the Holocaust, is that the Holocaust is about robbery as much as it is about murder. And at this stage, it's much more, I think, about robbery than murder. Although, as Yanina's soon to find out, things change rapidly during 1941 and 1942. If you know the story of what happens in a place like Warsaw, I think one of the things that happens when the Germans put Jews into ghettos is that they quite quickly are able to control the amount of food that comes into the ghetto. So by surrounding Jews with barbed wire, or in this case with a high brick wall, with just a few gateways, then the amount of foodstuffs that can come into the ghetto are very carefully controlled. And essentially what you see in Warsaw across 1941 is an attempt to starve a Jewish community to death. Out in the city, Germans are eating about 3,000 calories a day. In the ghetto, it's just a couple of 100 calories, nothing like the amount of food that you need to live. And so this is a ghetto that really only survives because of smuggling. That kids are smuggling food into the ghetto during 1941 to keep this ghetto community alive. And Janina Bauman writes about that as a family. They're buying smuggled foods. The other thing they're trying to buy is medicine, because the other thing about the ghettos is it's not just a case of starving a community to death, a kind of slow starvation, but it's about also, in a sense, creating a highly concentrated living space, overcrowded living conditions where disease spreads very quickly. It's the very antithesis of the 2-meter rule that we're all experiencing at the moment. This is highly overcrowded conditions where epidemics flourish. And so typhus and typhoid, a number of epidemics become rife in this ghetto. And one of the other things that the Bauman family are trying to buy is they're trying to buy medicines within this ghetto. But at this point in the war, the Bauman family, I think, are trying to work out, and I think this is one thing that I think generally survivors think about a lot, is that survival, I often talk about it as is a spatial strategy. Survival means going there rather than here. It means moving from one place to another. But at this point in the war, the Bauman family decide to stay put. That they decide that actually the ghetto is terrible, but it may be worse for them to be outside the ghetto. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment, because I think it's striking for us that that's the case. Let's move further east, and we'll head into the Soviet Union. So we'll move into kind of Soviet territory. And as you know, there's these two kind of really big military moments in the war that are incredibly important when we try and understand what happens during the Holocaust. The first is 1939, when the Germans occupy Poland, and they start to create the ghettos that someone like the Bauman family are placed into. The second is this moment in 1941 where they occupy the Soviet territory. As you know, what happens in 39 to 41 is that essentially the Germans and the Soviets come to a kind of agreement, and they divide Poland into half. Half is the western half is occupied by the Germans, the eastern half is occupied by the Soviets. But after 2 years, that all falls apart, and the Germans move eastwards into this part of Poland that was occupied by the Soviets, and they gradually move into Soviet territory as well. And so the Germans push eastwards into Soviet territory. And then you get, I think, a very different experience for Jews and a very different kind of set of questions. So it's in some ways there's some similarities. I think it's still Jews asking the question, is the ghetto the safest place to be or not? But Jews are also asking another set of questions about where the safest place to be is. And maybe I can just illustrate that through this family. This is a guy called Earl Grief, who sadly died just a couple of years ago, a Holocaust survivor who lived in the United States. And he was a part of a Jewish family in a little rural community in this part of the former Soviet-controlled zone, which the Germans occupied in 1941. He's got a mum and dad, Isaac and Miriam, and then he's got an older sister called Reisel. There's him and his brother, who are very similar in age, so two kind of older boys. And then there's a little girl called Devorah. So it's a family of two boys and two girls in this little Jewish community. Now, what I think is interesting is that as the Germans invade, this family are trying to decide, do we stay where we are, or do we flee eastwards ahead of the invading German army? Like, where's the safest place to be? And what you find is that well over 1 million Jews do head eastwards from these territories into the Soviet Union. And one of those is this girl called Reisel. So his older sister, she runs away from home. The family have a kind of conference, you know, they kind of sit down as a family together at the dinner table and decide, like, what's the safest thing to do? And she says, the safest thing I think for me to do is to head eastwards. And she does that, interestingly, because she's a member of the Communist Party. So she's a very political individual. She's really interested in politics. She joins the Communist Party, and she's part of the kind of young communist league within this region. And what she thinks is she thinks that she'll be targeted as a communist by the Nazis as they enter into this community. And so the safest place for a communist to be is out of there, eastwards, into Soviet territory. She doesn't think at this point that the Germans are going to target Jews in quite the same way. That communists, she thinks, are more at risk than Jews are. And so it's the one communist in this family who heads east, and the 5, if you like, non-communist Jews in this family stay put, because they think that actually it might be safer to stay put. Although things changed dramatically in 1941 and into 1942. As you probably know, and Jack referred to this, one of the people talk about, there's a guy called Patrick Dubois who's written about the Holocaust by bullets, that this very first stage of murder, of what I guess we'd call genocide, you know, the kind of intended killing of an entire ethnic group, the intended killing of the Jewish community of Europe. It begins not in the camps of occupied Poland, but it begins in these little communities out in eastern Poland and into the Soviet Union, as Jews in these communities are rounded up and shot on the edge of town by the Einsatzgruppe in 1941 and into 1942. It's in this place, in the bloodlands, that the Holocaust becomes a process of mass murder. And what this family do is they are trying to evade these killings. And so what they're doing is they're moving into the forests, like so many hundreds of thousands of Jews in this region, and moving into the forested areas around them to try and survive in the forests. In the summer, it's easier to do that than it is in the winter. There's some foodstuffs available. In the winter, it's often far too difficult to survive in the forest, and the family try and come, and they end up in one of these labor camps that have been set up for Jews, and then they move back into the forest, and then they move back into a labor camp for the winter. Earl and Liebel leave, and they head to the forest, and they survive the war in the forests of Eastern Europe. Sadly, their father, their mother, and their baby sister are killed, and are killed just outside of town in another forest where Jews are taken to be murdered from this particular small ghetto in this particular community. One thing that I've always been struck by Earl's story, and this is a story that you could replicate, I think, so many times over, is that this little family, Reisel apart, experiences a landscape that's incredibly proximate. So none of this family, apart from Reisel, they never go more than, say, 5 miles away from their home during this entire period of the Holocaust. Isaac, Miriam, and Devorah are killed literally a mile or so away from their home. Erlen Liebel survived the Holocaust in the forests literally a few miles away from their home. There's something about this place and this early stage of the Holocaust, which is about the murder or the survival of millions of Jews very close to home. This is not the kind of mass transportation of Jews across the whole European continent as we see it somewhere like Auschwitz, but it's a much more, I often talk about it as kind of like a kind of genocide that happens within the neighborhood, in front of neighbors, sometimes with the help of neighbors. It's a kind of intimate killing or hiding that takes place often within the rural landscape of vast swathes of Eastern Europe. This is a quote, a long quote from the kind of founder figure in many ways of Holocaust studies, a guy called Raoul Hilberg. And he talks about the way that there's really these two phases to the Holocaust. Phase one is where the killers go to the victims, the Einsatzgruppen, shooting small numbers of Jews, like Earl's family members, just outside their community. And then there's this second stage that takes place where the victims are brought to the killers. And I guess that's one thing that we're more familiar with, those of us who've been to somewhere like Auschwitz, or to a place like at Bergen-Belsen. So let's move on to that kind of second stage, which is this sort of centralization of killing. I think it's this radical shift in the Holocaust, because I think you have this much more dispersed genocide that takes place in 1941 and into 1942, which is literally spread across a whole swathe of Eastern Europe and in Soviet territory, and it's tiny numbers of Jews, often sometimes larger groups in say the ravines of Baba Yar, but often smaller numbers of Jews that are killed very close to home. But that switches in 1942 become this centralized killing as Jews are transported to a number of purpose-built death camps. First of all, to the death camp of Helno, then Treblinka and Sobibor and Belzec, and then finally Auschwitz, which is a place that many of us have been to. Now, one thing about Auschwitz, I think, is that when individuals are taken there, they suddenly experience, I think, for the very first time, the scale of the Holocaust. It's interesting. I was really struck by Jack's introduction, because Jack talked about going to Auschwitz, and it was for the first time when he went to Auschwitz that he realized the scale of the Holocaust. I think that's a very familiar experience. That I don't know if you think back to the time you went there for the first time. I think about the time I went there for the first time, the thing I remember the most is climbing up the guard tower at Birkenau and standing and looking out and thinking, wow, this place is big. You see the kind of size of Auschwitz, and you're really struck by the enormity of this purpose-built killing site. And one thing I think that's really struck me is that experience that we have had of going to that place and suddenly realizing the scale of the Holocaust is exactly the experience that many Jews had when they were taken there for the first time. This family, I think, is a great example. These are three sisters, the Gelb sisters, Locke's Gelb sisters there, three girls who are from a place called Starowice in Poland. They are taken to Auschwitz, I think it's in 1943. Before that, they've been in these kind of labor camps in Poland. So this is kind of a thing that you find, I think, across Poland, is that often what you find is waves of killing, often one or two or three waves of killing of a community, with just a few more able-bodied people, if you like, left as labor, including these three teenage girls. And so their whole experience of the Holocaust up until this point, 1943, when they're taken to Auschwitz, is that they're in there, again, just a few miles from home. So they've only ever gone like a few miles from home as they've been in these labor camps. Suddenly, 43, they're taken to Auschwitz, and they arrive at Auschwitz, and they can't believe how big the place is. And they can't believe how many different languages are being spoken there. If you've read a bit of Primo Levi, you know that Primo Levi talks about Auschwitz being like a Babel, where there's all of these different languages being spoken. One thing I did once was look at the block book that survives from one of the barracks in the women's camp at Birkenau. And what you see literally like 20 or so language groups in one single barracks. And these three girls end up in one of those barracks. They haven't got a clue what anyone's saying because they only speak Polish, but they hear about 20 different languages being spoken by the women around them. And it's at that moment that they realize that it's not just the Jews of Starowice who are being murdered, but it's Jews across all of Europe. So it's at that moment that they suddenly realize the continental scale of a genocide that up until that point, I think, has largely been experienced at a very kind of local scale, a very intimate scale. You know, rather than this being a genocide in the neighborhood, this is suddenly a genocide that's cross-continental in scale. And that's the realization that these women have. They realize as they hear someone speaking French or speaking Greek or speaking Hungarian, they realize that actually Jewish communities from all the way across Europe are being transported to camps like Auschwitz, and in particular to this most international camp of Auschwitz. And they're taken there on the rail network of Europe. This is the point where I guess one of these kind of dominant motifs becomes so central. You know, in this the very early stage of the Holocaust, there's very little movement, either in the ghettos in Warsaw or in the forests around the little town where Earl and his brother live. There's very little movement. Suddenly in the second phase, from 1942 and 43 onwards, there's kind of massive movement across the European continent. And it's this point that the train network of Europe is called into service as Jews are shunted back and forth, including, as those of us who've been to Auschwitz know, from even as far away as Greece, you know, a journey of well over a week in these train cars. One of the things I was really struck by when I was listening to Holocaust survivors talk about those journeys and describe those journeys was how often they drew on their senses other than sight. Kind of makes sense, doesn't it? If you think about the inside of the train cars, that they're these incredibly restricted spaces where there's often just a little kind of a little gap where there's a little bit of light that's coming into the car. But what happens is that there's a sort of reduction to another set of senses, the sense of smell, the stench of the train car, to the kind of visceral sense of thirst, which people talk about as well. And one thing I think that's important to remember, and you might have this experience sometimes, is that when you listen to a survivor tell their story of the Holocaust, there's often a kind of a very different way of describing the events compared to, say, the ways that historians traditionally describe the events. So if you're a historian who, in a sense, privileges the Nazi documentation, then in some ways, the way that you tell the Holocaust is you tell the Holocaust through, say, a map like this, which is about the mass movement of people across the European continent to a place like Auschwitz-Birkenau. But if you listen to survivors, this is not about mass movement. This is about a much more kind of limited repertoire of words and senses that's not about mobility, but is about immobility. And there's a kind of irony, I think, there. There's almost like a different story that emerges inside those cattle cars than the story that we might tell as we look at them moving around the European continent. And one thing I've been struck by is the way that so many survivors tell the story of those train journeys just as a story of two buckets. One bucket that's full and quickly becomes empty as the water for the journey is drunk, and another bucket that's empty and becomes full, quickly full, the latrine within the train car, where everyone is forced to go to the toilet in public, in many ways, often for the first time, and especially for an Orthodox teenage girl, you know, a kind of horrific experience. These train cars that take people to Auschwitz are not just about modernity and about movements, but they're also about degradation and about a kind of reduction of humans in the process. And there's more movement that takes place right at the end of the war. And I think this is one of the kind of really striking points that, if you like, in a sense, the story I'm telling is that there's a kind of an immobility or a kind of closeness, a proximate, a smallness to the very early stages of the Holocaust, whether it's one flat in Warsaw or one forest just outside a little community. Then there's this kind of opening up as the Holocaust becomes this continental scale event and Jews are moved by train all the way across the European continent. But the movement doesn't stop there, because in a sense, the camps actually themselves take to the roads in 1945. One thing that happens in 1945 is, as the Red Army are pushing westwards, the entire camp of Auschwitz is put onto the road in the so-called death marches, as this camp and then other camps to the west are literally marched around the road network of Europe. And I often think about it as not so much just kind of prisoners being marched out of the camp, but in a sense, the entire camp itself being taken onto the road and becoming a kind of mobile camp. Prisoners are marched 5 abreast, as they have been out of Auschwitz. Instead of being surrounded by barbed wire fencing, they're now surrounded by the sight lines of guards who have their rifles trained on them. Slowing down means escape. and you're shot by the side of the road. And suddenly Jews are forced marched into Germany. And it's at this moment that Germany sees Jews, I think for the first time since Jews have been deported from Germany in 1941. It's the first time that Jews see Germany in many cases. And what's interesting, I think, about Polish Jews, say, who suddenly enter into Germany is they start to see a country that's on its knees and that is about to suffer defeat. And it seems that that survival now means just hanging on in there in these final stages of the war. And for some people, survival is actually about being literally just trying to keep walking around and around in circles until you're liberated on the road. Some Jews aren't liberated in camps. They're liberated on the road network of Europe, or the rail network of Europe, as they're kind of shunted back and forth to the very few camps that are left within Europe in this period, as these camps within Germany become this kind of dumping ground for Jews from the entire camp system of Europe. And the most important of those dumping grounds, I guess, for us as British students and scholars is Bergen-Belsen, where Jack was saying, a number of you have been in this anniversary year. Bergen-Belsen becomes this, as you saw, this dumping ground in the spring of 1945. It becomes a dumping ground because it's one of the very few places that are left. There's very few camps left by March, April, May 1945. Most of the camps in the east have been liberated by the Soviets, and the Allies are increasingly moving from the west. And so you've got this kind of narrow bit of Germany, a little bit of Austria as well initially, that's left within the regime, the Third Reich. And into those camps are dumped literally thousands and thousands of Jews. In the case of Bergen-Belsen, tens of thousands of Jews each week in March 1945. And what happens in those camps is I think, in a sense, your survival strategies change. And that for many survivors, this is the very worst moment for them. It's interesting, if you ask the Lox-Gelb sisters who were in Auschwitz in 43 and suddenly realized the continental scale, their interviewers asked them, what was the worst camp you were in, expecting them to say Auschwitz, and they say Ravensbrück in the spring of 1945. So many survivors say the worst camp they were in was Bergen-Belsen in the spring of 1945, because it seemed that this was just total chaotic dying. It seemed that the kind of organized killing that had characterized this kind of mid-period, the genocide focused on the gas chambers of Auschwitz, had broken down, and in the place of killing was just dying. And I talk about a place like Bergen-Belsen in 1945 as almost, I suggest, a post-genocidal landscape. And in some ways, the post-genocidal landscape is the most terrifying landscape of all, because it feels like no one's in control anymore. It's bad enough having the Nazis in control, but it's even worse when no one's in control. And it seems like death itself is in control. And survivors talk about this sense, I think, that these become almost just kind of death zones, where it feels like this kind of primeval force of death has taken over. And that you're lucky to survive, very lucky to survive this kind of final terrible landscape of these very few camps within West. Just final thoughts, that what I think you find is that this is a genocide that I think broadly moves eastwards, first of all, in 1941, 42, and then moves westwards in 43 and 44. And 45. There's a sense in which the genocide is something that's kind of constantly moving through the European landscape. And as it does, it changes shape in very important ways. And it moves from ghettos to killings just outside forests, to hiding within forests, to centralized killing, to camps being put onto the road, to dying taking the place of killing within the camps like Bergen-Belsen. And what you find as a result of the fact that this is a genocide that's constantly moving, and that is moving people around in the later stages, is that by the end of the war, Jews are finding themselves all the way across Europe, scattered in these camps in Germany, and often so far from home. And so for those Lox-Gelb sisters, they end up in Ravensbrück in Germany, the camp of Ravensbrück, and they think, what do we do now? I mean, we're in Germany, what do? We want to go home. So they decide, we'll go back to Poland and see if anyone's alive. their mother and their father, they're separated from their father at Auschwitz, as all Jews are separated along gender line at the ramp at Auschwitz. They've been separated from their mother back in Sarajevo, and they don't know where she's been taken. And they think, what we'll do is we'll go home and we'll see if mum and dad are still alive, because they'll probably try and go home as well. So they get on a train, they make it to Łódź in the west of Poland. They meet a few people there who say, I wouldn't go home if I were you, because Jews aren't very popular. They'll think you're coming back to get your property. You might be murdered, but they just say, we've got to go home because we've got to go and see if our mum and dad are alive. They go home and they find that the entire community, Jewish community, has been destroyed, and they quickly realize that actually what that means is that their mother and father have been killed, and they start heading west. They head to Germany into one of the DP camps, one of which is set up in the former SS barracks in Bergen-Belsen, and that you'll have learnt about it, those of you who've been to Bergen-Belsen. And so I think this idea of movement that starts to take place in 1942 is one that continues after the war, that Jews continue to be on the move in 1945, 46, 47, and then often, in many cases after that, on the move as they leave Europe and head to other countries. For many of the survivors you've met, they'd come to Britain. After the war, others go to the United States or to Israel, to Australia, to other countries after the war. There's a sense in which the Holocaust is a story of movement. It's literally a moving story. But there's also these moments, I think, early on that it's important not to lose sight of, where the Holocaust is actually a story about stasis, not movement, about Jews who live, hide and die much closer to home. This is genocide in the neighborhoods as well as genocide on the continental scale. I should stop there and we could see if there's any questions.